He revolutionized the guitar, inspired millions, and redefined rock itself. Yet behind Eddie Van Halen's infectious grin and mind-bending solos lay rivalries few ever knew about. There were 6 guitarists he admired, competed with, and at times couldn't stand. What drove this hidden tension between legends? And why did some of rock's greatest names end up on Eddie's secret hate list? Join us as we find out the 6 guitarists Eddie Van Halen hated the most. Before Eruption, before the screaming crowds, a teenage Eddie Van Halen was sitting in his Pasadena bedroom with a cheap guitar and a worn stack of Cream records. Night after night, he dropped the needle on Crossroads, trying to capture every bend and fiery lick from Eric Clapton's Les Paul. Clapton wasn't just an influence. He was the reason Eddie picked up the guitar. He once told Guitar World, "Clapton was my main influence. I used to sit there for hours trying to figure out what he was doing. I'd play that solo on Crossroads note for note. He was God to me." In those early years, Eddie didn't care about fame or tone or songwriting. He wanted to understand what made Clapton's playing feel alive. The phrasing, the sustain, and the pauses shaped his musical DNA. But time changes everything. By the late 1970s, Eddie Van Halen had done something even Clapton hadn't. He reinvented the electric guitar. When Eruption hit, it sounded like it came from another world. His two-handed tapping, harmonic squeals, and dive bombs redefined guitar technique. Suddenly, this shy kid from Pasadena became the future of rock. Fans worshipped him, but not everyone cheered. The old guard, musicians Eddie once idolized, listened with skepticism. In 1980, when Clapton was asked about Van Halen, his response stunned Eddie. Clapton said, "He's very good technically, but I don't hear much soul." It was a casual remark, but it cut deep. For Eddie, it was heartbreaking. The man who'd shaped his style now dismissed his music as mechanical. Years later, he admitted, "It kind of broke my heart. I learned everything from him. I wasn't trying to outplay him. I was inspired by him. To hear that he didn't like what I was doing really got to me." Eddie never fired back. He never insulted Clapton in interviews. But friends say he quietly wrestled with the disappointment and how strange it felt to be rejected by his hero. Part of the clash came from philosophy. Clapton's guitar work was built on restraint, a blues-rooted style where tone and phrasing told the story. Eddie's was about freedom, distortion, feedback, and fearless experimentation. In a sense, they represented 2 eras. Clapton, the sound of the 60s. Eddie, the sound of the future. Yet even through the pain, the admiration never faded. In 1995, Eddie admitted, "Clapton's tone on Crossroads, that's still untouchable. I don't care what anybody says. That's pure feeling. You can't fake that." The 2 men eventually met in Los Angeles in the mid-1980s. Eddie was hopeful, like a fan meeting his idol for the first time. Clapton was polite but distant. They talked about guitars, tone, and amps, but not about emotion. Afterwards, Eddie told a friend, "He's just a man. I think I loved the myth more than the person." That moment changed him. It was when Eddie stopped seeing legends as gods and started seeing them as humans, brilliant but flawed. Later, when asked if Clapton's words still bothered him, Eddie laughed softly. "Nah. Maybe he didn't get it. Maybe I didn't get him either. We're from different planets, man." That line captured them perfectly. 2 guitar gods from different worlds. Clapton painted with blues and shadows. Eddie splashed neon across the sky. After Eddie's passing in 2020, Clapton reportedly spoke warmly of him in private, calling him a true innovator. Though he never made a public statement, fans who knew their story understood the gesture. By then, Eddie had long made peace with it. In 2001, he told Guitar World, "If Clapton hadn't existed, neither would I. Whatever he thinks of me doesn't change that." By the end, Eddie's admiration hadn't vanished, it had matured. "I'll always be chasing what I heard on those old Cream records," he once said. That's where the fire started. Eddie's heartbreak over Clapton ran deep, but his next feud burned hotter. This time, it wasn't disappointment. It was pure rivalry. Two guitar gods, one stage, and no room for compromise. What happens when Eddie Van Halen goes head-to-head with the dark wizard of the Stratocaster? There are few things more nerve-wracking for a young guitarist than meeting a hero, especially when that hero is Ritchie Blackmore, the moody and unpredictable genius behind Deep Purple and Rainbow. For a teenage Eddie Van Halen, Blackmore wasn't just another rock star. He was a prophet of tone. Eddie would study Burn and Highway Star note for note, replaying them until his fingers bled. He admired the precision of Blackmore's solos, the bite of his distortion, and that haunting sense of drama that hung over every riff. To Eddie, Ritchie was one of the few who could make a guitar sound truly alive. When Van Halen's debut album exploded in 1978, Eddie suddenly found himself standing alongside the men he'd grown up idolizing. He was no longer a kid with a Strat copy in his bedroom. He was a peer, a chart-topping guitarist rewriting the rules of rock. But the dream soured quickly when he finally met one of his gods. In a 1982 interview with guitar players Jazz Obrecht, Eddie recalled their first encounter. "He just stared at me," Eddie said. "Wouldn't say hi, nothing. I was crushed. I thought, wow, I looked up to this guy my whole life, and he just blew me off." That silence hit harder than any insult. Eddie wasn't arrogant. He was disarmingly open, a guy who could talk gear and pick up wiring for hours. He jammed with anyone and laughed easily. What stayed with him about Ritchie was the chill, the blank stare, the lack of warmth, the total absence of connection. Years later, Eddie mentioned it again. "People like Joe Perry and Ritchie Blackmore just gave me the shaft with their eyes," he told Rock and Roll Garage. "Wouldn't say hello. Wouldn't be nice. No nothing. I'm not that way." That phrase, "the shaft with their eyes," summed up the sting perfectly. Eddie had just unleashed Eruption, a solo that detonated guitar technique and forced every rock musician to rethink what was possible. Yet his heroes, the men whose posters had once hung on his wall, looked at him with something colder than rivalry, dismissal. Part of it was Ritchie's personality. Blackmore was famously difficult, even with his own bandmates. His mystique depended on distance. And when he was asked years later what he thought of Van Halen, his response felt like both a compliment and a jab. "He's a fine player," Blackmore said, "but I think he plays too many notes." Fans argued for years over that line. Was it jealousy or old-school snobbery? In truth, it revealed a deeper divide in the split between two eras of rock guitar. Blackmore's style was shaped by classical phrasing and restraint. Every bend and vibrato was deliberate. Eddie's playing was the opposite. Fluid, explosive, and unbound. Where Ritchie crafted control, Eddie embodied freedom. It wasn't exactly a feud, more a generational standoff. Eddie was the face of a new movement, the Californian innovators who rewired their amps, built their own guitars, and chased tones no one had ever heard. Blackmore was the last of the disciplined British hard rock purists, his fretwork rooted in precision and structure. Still, Eddie never turned that cold encounter into bitterness. In a 1995 Guitar World interview, he looked back with understanding. "I was probably just too sensitive back then. Maybe he was shy, or didn't know what to say. But man, I worshipped that guy growing up. Still do." And over time, even Ritchie softened. In 2008, he told Classic Rock magazine, "Eddie Van Halen brought something new. I can't deny that. What he did with the whammy bar, the tapping, it was clever. He found his own voice. It was recognition, the very thing Eddie had once hoped for." Their paths diverged, yet they stayed bound by influence. Blackmore drifted into medieval ballads and Renaissance melodies with Blackmore's Night, chasing elegance over aggression. Eddie stayed restless, forever tinkering with his guitars and tone circuits, chasing the sound no one else could find. And he did. By the time the world lost Eddie Van Halen in 2020, even die-hard Blackmore fans had accepted what their hero finally admitted: he was brilliant. He found something that everyone else was trying to find. The words came decades late, but for Eddie Van Halen, they were enough. But Eddie would soon face a different kind of rejection, one loud, swaggering, and soaked in attitude. In 1978, Van Halen was the new thunderstorm rolling across rock's skyline, raw, electrifying, and impossible to ignore. The band's debut album had just begun to shake the airwaves, and Eddie Van Halen, barely 23, was still the hungry kid from Pasadena trying to prove he belonged among the guitar gods. Each night on tour, he tore through solos like his life depended on it. But behind the amps and flashing lights, something quietly stung him. The cold indifference of the men he'd grown up idolizing, players like Joe Perry of Aerosmith. Eddie once told Jazz Obrecht in a 1982 Guitar Player interview how that early tour felt. "People like Joe Perry would just give me the shaft with their eyes," he recalled. "Wouldn't say hello. Wouldn't be nice. No nothing. I'm not that way." Imagine being the young prodigy on the road, playing with everything you have, night after night, and when you finally bump into the heroes whose posters hung on your wall, they don't even look your way. No nod. No smile. Just that cold, unreadable stare. He felt that Perry and others like Ritchie Blackmore saw him as a threat. In that same interview, he put it bluntly, they wouldn't go out of their way to help anybody, 'cause they would feel threatened. It wasn't just bitterness. It was an honest read of the generational shift happening in the late 70s. Eddie's style, fluid, fearless, and rooted in invention, had redrawn the map of electric guitar playing. The old guard was blues and swagger. The new one was speed, precision, and sonic experimentation. Perry, a cornerstone of the 70s hard rock, came from a school built on riff-heavy grooves and raw attitude. His tone was thick, swampy, and full of sleaze, the soundtrack of cigarette smoke and backstage chaos. Eddie's, by contrast, was lightning in stereo. His two-hand tapping, his use of harmonics and whammy bar dives, and his obsession with tone shaping made his sound futuristic, almost alien. To some veterans, it didn't feel like evolution, more like an invasion. Eddie never confronted Perry publicly, never lashed out. But privately, he couldn't shake how strange it felt to be treated like an outsider by the very people who'd inspired him. He wasn't asking for mentorship, just a handshake, a moment of shared respect. Instead, he walked away with a quiet resolve. If they wouldn't open the door, he'd build a new one. Still, Eddie's heart wasn't wired for grudges. He loved the guitar too much for that. He once said, "I don't give a fuck if I'm playing a Holiday Inn lounge, I enjoy playing." That line said everything about his spirit. He played for the sheer thrill of creation, not politics, not approval. Music, to him, was an act of joy. And if others couldn't see that, it was their loss. Ironically, years later, Joe Perry would completely reverse his stance. Time has a way of stripping away ego and leaving only truth. In 2013, during an interview covered by Van Halen News Desk, Perry looked back with open admiration. Eddie's playing was just phenomenal. He took everything that he'd heard and put his own stamp on it. I thought, oh my God, this is great. He reinvented guitar playing. Perry described hearing Van Halen's debut album for the first time, completely floored by what he was listening to. "I was blown away," he admitted. "I kept going back to figure out those little tricks and things, the sound, the energy. It was just so different." For Eddie, that belated respect came too late to erase the sting of those early years, but it spoke volumes about his impact. Even those who once turned away eventually had to acknowledge what he had done, not just for rock, but for the guitar itself.